So my name is Alec. I'm at Lawrence Livermore, along with Greg, working on Spack for the past couple of years. There's a large group of us that give the Spack tutorial, but Greg and I thought it would be really fun to give a meta presentation on how to give a good tutorial now that we've been doing it for a number of years, and felt that this would be an excellent audience of people since you all in HBSF are building your own tools in the HPC world, and ultimately also trying to advertise them to the larger community. So with that, I'll hand it off to Greg to start this story.
So we've been doing Spack tutorials since 2016. I started trying to count them up, and I was struggling, but it's somewhere over 30 Spack tutorials. I think close to 40 I've given somewhere in the low 30s. We present at least 3 times a year. And overall, we feel that it has been worth the pain. And I'm not going to say that there's no pain involved in running a tutorial, but we're also going to talk about how to mitigate that pain and maybe keep the amount of work to run a tutorial to a minimum. So why have a tutorial at all? Maybe you would like to retire someday without your project ending. And for that, you need other maintainers. And to get maintainers, you probably need a lot of power users for some of those power users to become maintainers. And the best way to get power users of your project is to have a lot of users. Downside to that, users do unpleasant things like notice bugs and report them. But in the long run, it's good for your project. And maybe it's not about the long term of the project, but you just want to help people use your project. Presumably, you think that your project is useful. Or also, maybe you want some help from them, again, in terms of contributions to the project. If you look here, this is a graph of, or a chart of contributions to Spack over time by lines of code, sorted by institution, although that's not really what we're looking at. And down here is around when we started giving public presentations about Spack, and the first Spack tutorials somewhere around here. So we think it's been helpful to us in terms of getting a lot of contributors to the project. So why not have a tutorial then? Maybe your project isn't ready to take advantage of it yet. If things are pretty rough and you really only can support power users so far, or that's where you're at in your project's life cycle, okay, that's a good reason. You can go over in the other room, maybe don't listen to me. The other reason is it's work. And it can be a lot of work. If you don't have continuous integration set up, or some of these other things that Alec is about to talk about, you can end up like me, sitting in your office for 80 hours the week before supercomputing, with a sleeping bag under the desk, trying to get all of the live demos to work. Don't do it that way. Do all the things that Alec is about to tell you, and then it is a more manageable amount of work. It's still work, but you keep it within the realm of what's worth it for the payoff. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Alec.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm going to say even with all of these tips, we occasionally have late nights right before supercomputing, but all of this really helps. And so the first thing that we get asked pretty often is, what format is the Spack tutorial in? And compared to a lot of the rest of tutorials I've seen, we have an open website. And we really encourage people to do this, because when you create a presentation and you give it at a conference, it's great, like this. But a lot of you are probably not going to remember what I'm saying 6 months from now, and you're going to want to go back and look at the presentation. And HBSF records all of these. They'll be on YouTube, so you can go back and look at them. But it's really helpful for something like an interactive tutorial for Spack for your users to be able to come back, show other people at their workplace how to continue working on the project or how to spin up, but also to come back and say, I did this a couple of months ago, and here's how I thought that it worked, and keep repeating that over time. We've also had other folks go out and start giving Spack tutorials without us. It has been pretty amazing, but people, small institutional tutorials for their different groups, teaching people, spawning them up on Spack. And this is all work that we haven't had to do just simply by open sourcing and creating online documentation for our Spack tutorial. So really making your tutorial accessible to people, or as accessible as possible, is very helpful. The next thing is about providing standardized environments. And so the first question that I often get when people look at me and they say, you did a 7-hour live demo, was how? Aren't you tempting the demo gods? And yes, but it's a little bit of a magic trick. Like, we control your environment very heavily inside of this Spack tutorial so that we have tested this over and over and over again, so there are relatively few areas we're gonna hit bugs during the tutorial. And really, by using something, we often end up using AWS virtual machines, but you can use them from Microsoft or Google or any of the other cloud hypervisors. Build on a single standardized platform. This also helps, you don't spend the first 30 minutes of your tutorial spinning everybody up on their laptops. You want everyone to drop into the same place. You want to make it as frictionless as possible for everyone to start using your project, not brew, not maybe Spack installing your project on their laptop. All of that is going to take extra time away from you and the cool demos that you want to give. So create containers, create virtual machines, try and standardize on having a single environment for your tutorial. And building up of that, use these standardized environments to script your inputs and your expected outputs for your program. This is really powerful because, as Greg said, there's a lot of pain when you're manually going in and you realize in the middle of the night that you've had a typo for the last 50 pages of your tutorial, and now you have to go back and rerun all of that. If you're doing that by hand, it takes a lot of time. If you're scripting your inputs and outputs, you can treat a tutorial kind of like an integration test, where you can say, I expect all of this functionality to exist and to work inside of my project, and here's how I expect the ordering of them to be run, and I expect this ordering to always work. It also helps to just automatically stick all of those inputs and outputs into your documentation. So we use the Sphinx program input-output plugin, but go for your static site generator of choice. There are lots of these for LaTeX or other sorts of programs. It is very helpful to have all of this scripted. So, as Greg said, building off of this with CI/CD, this is where I say really treat your tutorial like an integration test. Don't find the bugs in your tutorial the night before you're about to give it at supercomputing. We've done that a bunch of times. Greg and I have stayed up very late before conferences before with Todd. And it's never super fun. You don't want to find, I think 2 years ago we found that somebody added a package named all to Spack 2 days before we were about to give the tutorial. All is also a reserved keyword inside of our package's config. That broke a lot of stuff. And so continuously run your tutorial. Run it when people generate PRs, run it nightly, whatever frequency you want. But this really helps you find bugs as they're going to arise and make your life more painful well far ahead of the tutorial or well far ahead of the conference. This also gives you a nice added benefit that if somebody wants to come take your tutorial at some random point in the year, it's still going to work. It's not that your tutorial only works for a couple of weeks before a conference. So with that, and getting to conferences, I'm going to hand it back over to Greg.
So the submission, or the evaluation criteria for a tutorial at a conference is almost the exact opposite of everything else. The last thing you want, in some sense, is novelty. If you have never presented your tutorial before, you probably won't get it into a big conference. So start with your institution or a smaller conference. Often it makes sense to start with your institution. You have users already. They might want to expand to the rest of the group, or the consultants in your HPC center, something like that. But that can help you get into then a smaller conference and then eventually to something like supercomputing. The other thing is treat your tutorial submission as seriously as you treat other submissions. A lot of tutorial submissions are someone threw together an idea and maybe they have an outline of their content, but you don't have a good abstract that puts the contribution of the tutorial, what are people going to learn, in context. A detailed description of what you're going to cover, why that is useful for people, time per section, how it's going to be hands-on versus slides, how they're going to keep the audience's attention, all of that stuff. If you put together a really clear submission, you help make it easy for the conference to say, oh yes, we haven't had this tutorial before, but we can see how useful it would be. Keeping your audience's attention. It's really easy as a developer to get focused on what you did to make something work and what was the hard part of writing the project. That's great, but it's not useful for a tutorial. Users aren't there to learn about your project. They're there to learn whether your project can help them. So tell them what the cool use case they can accomplish with your tool is. If you go through, here are all of the options to this command, out of the context of what someone wants to accomplish, no one will remember it. I can make your life easier in this way, and here's the option to turn on in my project that will make your life easier in this way. Also, for keeping people's attention, swag is really useful. We have repurposed tutorial honoraria as a way of getting t-shirts, this one included. And that seems to actually keep people's attention over lunch because they want to come back and get the t-shirt. So whatever works. I'll turn it back over to Alec.
Thanks. Yeah, so now that you've got a whole bunch of people in the room and they're staring at your slides or your documentation, you're doing hands-on activities, how do you take all of these people, like yourselves that are in the audience right now, and then turn them into folks who are going to continue to use your program and continue to ask questions? And so, first of all, during the tutorial, if you make it known that your tutorial is open source, people, if they go find a typo, they can fix bugs. They could go suggest an improvement for the language if they didn't understand something the first time but heard you explain it or heard somebody ask a question in the audience. That's an easy way to get someone into being, even in a very light way, a contributor to your project. Also, I think that it's important to prioritize questions from new communities and new community members coming to the tutorials. The best tutorial is not one that always goes to plan. The best tutorial is one where you have really good questions and really good engagement from your audience. And if you don't get to everything, we typically structure our tutorials so that the basics are in the beginning, and as you get further into the day, it gets more advanced. If we miss something at the very end of the day, I almost never care, because it means that we had really good questions and we spent more time on the basics. And so you shouldn't try to measure yourself or the performance of your tutorial by getting to everything in that schedule. It should instead be take the time, answer questions, live work through something. We did a conference this past fall in which Kathleen and myself just prototyped building a more complex package because people had a lot of questions around packaging for Spack. They had already done some of the usage, but they were interested in becoming more packaging contributors. And so stopping, taking that time, and adjusting on the fly has really helped. Lastly, you should try and build a communication channel outside of the conference. Conference chats on the side of an interactive window are great, but they disappear after the conference. It's really helpful to create a space where folks can come in, they can ask questions there, and then they can continue asking questions after the conference. So we have this tutorial channel on our Slack, and I'll get more into Slack in just a second, but it's really helpful to have people have this space where everybody that's joining this channel right at the beginning of a tutorial is kind of in the same place. People can ask questions there if they're not comfortable asking them out in person. And then if somebody is continuing to work on something for a few days, maybe they were a little slower on one part or another, or they're trying to apply it to their specific workflow, they can come back there and ask questions. And we try to prioritize answering questions really quickly inside of that channel. We then, as people have been asking questions in those channels, we have the help channel and we have the general channel inside of our Slack. So it's the same Slack in both places. You've signed up to one place, and now you can start asking questions in the tutorial, and we can really easily move you over into kind of the general locations where we're not the only people answering your questions. It's tons of crowdsourced questions and answers that has really helped our community grow much further than just the FTEs at Livermore could pay for. So a quick shout out to Slack and a couple of the other of the messaging platforms. HPSF, if you are an HPSF project, you can get a Slack Pro plan for free. That means that you keep your conversation history forever. You can ask myself, Chris Clark, other people a part of HPSF if you don't have that already set up for your project. Or if you're a project interested in joining HPSF, it is one of those nice benefits that now you can have a stable home for your community. I'll also shout out Matrix and Zulip are two amazing open source options. If you choose to go that way, that is also great. I've had the most experience with Slack, but enjoy the rest of them. So now I'm going to hand it back over to Greg to talk about how you teach.
So the first thing is that even if you don't need to spin up new teachers, you don't want to teach an entire tutorial by yourself. The Spack tutorial ends up being about 6 hours of content. One time, with a bunch of tough circumstances, I ended up doing about 4 hours worth of that, and that was not an experiment that we have decided to repeat ever. So break it up into modular sections, and then this also helps with spinning up new teachers. When someone takes on a section, expect them to change it. Don't hand someone the section and go, here, you're presenting my words now, because that's not going to work well for them, and it's going to be much more intimidating for them to try to channel you. You've been doing it before. Instead, have them make it their own. We generally update at least twice a year most of the sections in our tutorial, and often it's cosmetic. It's a new person is presenting it. They're going to change the descriptions to fit the way that they're going to talk over the material. And it's not going to be the same way that I would, but I'm going to click accept and merge on their PR because it's helping them make that material their own. The first tutorial that they give is not going to be perfect. That's fine. It doesn't need to be perfect, right? You've got good content. They're going to be able to present it effectively, even if imperfectly. That said, don't send 3 new people all together to go give the tutorial on their own. That's not going to help. You've given this tutorial a bunch of times. You've seen what could possibly go wrong, especially with live demos, right? Have someone there who has been in it as long as possible, who can jump in and help when things go awry. And then, if you've got recordings of your tutorial, that can really help someone, especially with seeing kind of how the content flows as an actual presentation instead of as text that you're consuming statically. So if you're spinning up on a new section, you can go see someone present it. Oh, that's how this all ties together into a coherent talk. I might want to make some changes to help with my own flow, but I kind of get how it works now. When I was talking about keeping your audience's attention, I talked about what the user wants to get out of your project, right? You're thinking about your project in a different perspective when you're writing a tutorial than you are in most of your life as a developer. The first time we put together a Spack tutorial, I wrote out all of the commands for the basic section, and then I went and ran them all, and it just worked. And I was shocked because I never ran the commands that were working on my project. I only ran the commands that someone reported a bug. So take that opportunity. You're looking at the project from the perspective of the user. If you can't write a good description of why something works the way it does, or you can't write a good script for here's how you accomplish XYZ, that's a great opportunity to then go back and feed this back into your development. Oh, we don't have the right model for putting together a large software stack at a facilities level, because when I went to go write a tutorial for it, I found it was really awkward. And we can go back at that point and say, okay, what would I love the tutorial for this to look like? And design the feature around that, because that's now thinking about it from the perspective of the user. So this is a good way of thinking about it, designing the tutorial to keep someone's attention, make them want to be a part of your community, but it also, you can turn that around and make it, here's how I use the tutorial to figure out what changes I need to make in the project going forward.
One additional note there. If you get asked the same question over and over and over again in a tutorial, it might mean that it's not intuitive. And sometimes when we, especially software developers, spend a large amount of time with something, this little golem that you've molded from clay, it looks perfect to you, but you might be missing something that is to other people kind of obvious. And so it's really helpful to have new people come and look at your project every once in a while and give you a lot of feedback on what maybe works really well and what doesn't. And you can see that by how quickly they pick something up.
Yeah. Thanks, Alec. So conclusions, nothing that should be surprising after hearing us speak, right? We think this is an effective way to grow your community. It's been effective for us, and we think that that can be generalized. It can be a lot of work, but if you structure it well, you can make that work much smaller, and it can be well worth it. And then really, to take advantage of this, it's not just about what you do in the tutorial, but how you interact with the new people that your tutorial brings in. So have the communication channels open, and then really look at how you're interacting with these new people. We have a policy on the Spack project that if a new contributor wants to take a stab at a feature, it doesn't matter whether that feature is a priority for us. Helping them get it in is now a priority for us. Because if we prioritize this potential contributor's issues, they're going to come around and they're going to keep helping out in the long run. So it's the whole communication channel, all the way from here's the tutorial, let's keep your attention, here's where you can ask questions later, here's how you get involved, and let's really make you a member of the community as you try to scale up after the tutorial. So with that, I think we're ready for any questions.
Thanks. Hey, I enjoyed your talk. I have a question following up on your last point. So you have everybody together, they're going through the tutorial. Do you do anything before and after, now you've got everybody in person and interacting?
We haven't done any sort of explicit community building in the room sort of stuff. I don't, off the top of my head, know how that would look, although it's an interesting idea. For us, it's much more been about making sure that there's an easy next step for the person. So if you come to our tutorial, you're getting onto our Slack instance in the tutorial to ask questions. So you're already there, so the next step is easy. And if you say, I want this feature, and I look at the feature you're asking about, and I'm like, actually, that would be a good new user feature. Hey, here's the file where I think you would need to make that change. I can't make it a priority right now, but if you put up a PR, I'll make sure to review it this week. And that sort of make every next step as easy as possible.
So you're really continuing that interpersonal relationship basically outside of the tutorial, which is excellent.
Yeah, thank you for that talk. I think that really reflects the experience of giving 30 to 40 tutorials. There's a lot of nuance in what you guys are talking about. So I'm going to make a suggestion that maybe you won't be happy with, but so I come from teaching with the Carpentries Foundation, and one of the value propositions of the Carpentries Foundation is the setup you do on the user's machine is part of what you're giving them, right? And I know if you're going to use Spack and your AWS instance disappears, right? I mean, not that Spack setup is very complicated, but you would often want to set it up in their particular environment. So if you're an HPC center, you'd want them to set it up in their, maybe in their home directories, and maybe the HPC center has a build cache you want to make use of. Or if you're at a conference like supercomputing, it might be fun and interesting for people to mess around with the persistent installation, right? So I guess my question here is, how feasible do you think it would be to have a binary build cache of several commodity architectures that they can set up on their local machines, something instead of like very specific processors, maybe their families, and wouldn't that be worth the setup to have a persistent installation they can play with?
It's a really good question. It's somewhere that we are building towards in our build cache. It's not so much the cost of just like storing the binaries for a couple different variants of OS operating system, or like OS and platform variants, but really gets to be updating those continuously over time to make sure that they continue to work inside of our CI system. We run a few 100,000 builds a week already, and that's for like a relatively narrow subset of our packages and our platforms that we're targeting. We're building out to that inside of the Spack functionality to have more binary interoperability. We used to be more locked to individual distributions. We now do a lot of like modeling of the libc so that we can go across versions. It's something that we've really thought about. I think every HPC center sets up Spack a little differently. And so when you talk about getting into like integrating with a build cache for a specific site is a bit harder. We have given tutorials to individual institutions, or we've gone and sat down with people and talked about their usage of Spack before. Last year after this conference, we went and talked to a bunch of the guys from Fermilab who are here today. They were very gracious and hosted us, and we sat and talked with them for a day. And we didn't give so much of quite the tutorial. We gave a little bit of like the intro and basic section there, but a lot of it was just trying to optimize their flow of Spack. So we've done a little bit of that, but it is a hard problem because it's so different.
I would say some of this is specific to Spack and how tailored the binaries have to be to make the tutorial run properly. If you're working on a Python tool, our description of what a common environment for the tutorial is going to be very different as well.
I have a question here. I guess a step between actually giving the tutorial and making the material, which is pretty much coming up with the right title and maybe the right abstract. Do you have like any insights in kind of making those things kind of appealing to a community and maybe spark their curiosity to kind of have like a healthy audience for your tutorial instead of maybe just like being pedantic or like very detailed and attracting like a smaller crowd?
Yeah, I think it's hard to be very general about that because it's very much about what problem do you solve. The abstract for our tutorial looks something like this. Building things for HPC keeps getting harder and you keep spending more time doing it. Here is a tool that can help you spend less time doing it. That's obviously a very brief summary of what we're talking about, and we in our abstract we cover a little bit of like what the work in this space is besides Spack and things like that, but really center it around the problem that you're solving. This is the same thing as how you keep someone's attention once they're in the room. How do you catch someone's attention? Well, they have a problem that you can take away for them.
Yeah, and with that, I think we do need to move on to the next one, but Greg and Alec will be here all week, and I'm sure that we could find some space in the Spack user meeting to discuss this further. So Thursday and Friday we'll be there. But Patrick, if you want to start, or one more round of applause for our speakers.